Hello, everyone. I'm Tom Coffey, president of Louisville Forum. Welcome to our November 2024 program. The Louisville Forum programs typically meet at noon on the second Wednesday of each month here at Vincenzo's Restaurant downtown. All are welcome. Founded in 1984, 40 years ago, the Louisville Forum is a nonpartisan public issues group. We host debates and discussions of contemporary and sometimes controversial public policy issues that impact the greater Louisville community. For more information on the Louisville Forum, our events, to join or to make a reservation, please visit louisvilleforum.org. Today's program, the election, who won, who lost, and what it means. I'm not going to give many remarks here at all. I certainly won't pontificate about what the forum is all about, but this is a contemporary, controversial public policy issues that impact Louisville. There couldn't be a more, this is the heart of what the Louisville Forum is all about. I'm really grateful you guys are all here, and we have 4 great speakers from varying perspectives to talk about what happened last week. Additionally, you guys may remember that in July, at our program, we had a forum on Amendment 2. So it's not just the national elections, but all the elections, all the things that were on the ballot in last week on our ballots are fair play here today. Our 4 speakers come with differing viewpoints and political perspectives. So let's get right to it. Sitting to my left here, Iris Wilbur-Glick. Iris is the owner of IW Strategies and has more than 15 years of political and policy experience. She's a former principal at McCarthy Strategic Solutions, former vice president of public policy and external affairs for Greater Louisville, Inc., the Metro Chamber of Commerce, and got her start as a political operative, consulting on campaigns and committees supporting gubernatorial, Senate, and presidential candidates. In the 2016 election, Iris worked with the National Republican Senatorial Committee, serving as regional political director of Indiana, Kentucky, and Ohio. Ahead of the 2014 election, she joined Mitch McConnell's campaign in early 2013 as political director to re-elect him. In the 2012 presidential race, Iris was based in New Mexico and Northern Nevada on behalf of the Republican National Committee as a state director. She's appeared on Kentucky Educational Television, WHAS 11 and 840 WHAS, where Iris has provided in-depth policy analysis, political commentary, and election night coverage. Iris is a recipient of the 2020 Young Professionals Association of Louisville Award and the National 2020 Women Serving Women Campaign Award from Women in Government Relations for her work advancing state and federal legislation supporting pregnant workers. She was also named one of Louisville Business First 2021 40 Under 40, Kentucky Gazette's 2020 Most Notable Women in Politics and Government, and Maverick Pac's Future 40 in 2014. Welcome back, Iris. Sitting next to Iris is Isaiah Kim Martinez. Isaiah Kim Martinez joined the WHAS 11 News team in the city of Louisville as a multi-skilled journalist in June 2021. Isaiah is the senior reporter at WHAS 11, primarily covering the big news of the day, politics, and government. Isaiah previously worked as a reporter in Chattanooga, Tennessee for 2 years, coincidentally another river city, where he covered everything from politics to national disasters to social justice movements. I didn't put this in his bio, but if you go to the WHAS 11 webpage, he was told at about 10 years old that because reporters get paid by the word, that ought to be the profession he goes into. So,
true story.
He's a proud graduate of the University of Miami, where he graduated a degree in broadcast journalism. During his time in school, Isaiah also worked at 2 hometown stations in Miami, WSVN 7 News in 2017, and later as a sports associate producer at NBC 6 Miami. Welcome, Isaiah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Philip Bailey. Philip M. Bailey is a Pulitzer Prize and Peabody Award-winning journalist who serves as chief political correspondent for USA Today, where he most recently covered the 2024 presidential race. A Louisville, Kentucky native and proud lifelong West End resident, He has covered campaigns across the country, but also the January 6, 2021 investigative hearings and in-depth national stories on election deniers, voting rights, and police accountability. His nearly 20-year career as a journalist has spanned from City Hall to Congress and the White House, across Leo Weekly, NPR, the Courier-Journal, and now with USA Today, where he hosted the organization's flagship vodcast, States of America, during the 2020 presidential campaign. Philip has appeared on multiple platforms to distill on U.S. and international politics, including MSNBC, NBC News, Roland S. Martin, the Chuck Todd Podcast, and Black in the Bluegrass, a public history podcast series that focuses on conversations with Black Kentuckians. Welcome, Philip.
Thank you.
Okay, and last but not least, Mike Ward. From 1989 to 1993, Mike served as a member of the Kentucky House of Representatives representing the Highlands area of Louisville. In 1994, Mike was elected to the United States House of Representatives, winning Kentucky's 3rd congressional district seat that was being vacated by Romano Mazzoli. Mike was one of the few Democrats to win an open seat in the Republican congressional landslide that 1994 year. Mike was then appointed by President Clinton as the Associate Director of the Peace Corps and served through President Clinton's 2nd presidential term. From 2002 to 2005, Mike hosted a talk radio show in Louisville that was a liberal counterweight to the conservative talk radio programming. Mike is the president of Ward Campaigns, Inc., and has spent the last 20 years working for a wide variety of candidates and the causes in over 20 states, including races at every level of elected office. Welcome, board member Mike Ward.
Thank you.
I'm gonna first open it up to Iris, and we're just gonna go into session for their opening remarks. Monday, Don G asked me how I was gonna handle this program, and I said I'm gonna say nothing and let them say everything. So, you guys go right ahead.
Sure.
Thanks, Iris.
Thank you, Tom, and good afternoon, Louisville Forum. It's so good to be back. I'm actually going to keep my opening remarks pretty brief because I would love for our panel here to have more of a discussion of what happened and what does that mean moving forward. I think that's sort of kind of where we're at. We've had a whole week, over a week now, to sort of process last Tuesday, and everyone's looking ahead. I know for me, like, I'm already having conversations about the midterm elections and kind of what we do to pivot and figure out this landscape. Some key takeaways. We'll get into the national piece, but I want to bring it more close to home. Louisville, we know the political composition, the voter registration dynamics here. However, Republicans not only held our own, but we made some gains, and that is significant. Again, despite the voter registration composition. So what does that ultimately mean? I feel that Louisville Republicans, not only were we effective on messaging, we executed a voter turnout strategy, but we were disciplined. And a lot of that is attributed to quality candidate recruitment. Nominees matter, especially in sort of the recent cycles we've had where primaries have been bloodied and contentious. But day one, quality candidate recruitment matters. And so I think Republicans deserve a lot of credit for quality candidate recruitment, and then coming together after primaries to ensure that eye is on the prize for that Tuesday in November. And then the dynamics of being outspent almost all the way across the board here locally, these Metro Council races and state legislative races, Republicans were outspent. And the ability to overcome that and still connect with voters and have enough resources to connect with voters just demonstrates that we had the winning message. And so we'll get more into sort of the composition, I think, like the ultimate winners. But some dynamics I want to highlight off the top is, in regards to spend and endorsements, we did see some activity, particularly from Governor Beshear on engaging in some of these Louisville-based races. And I will say, if you're just looking at sort of down ticket races, the impact was not felt. I know that there's some feelings about the amount of money being spent in politics, but on the Democratic side, there was no short supply. And so even though Democrats across the board for the most part had the cash advantage, that did not translate into results. And so we look at the Metro Council races where Republicans were able to flip 3 seats. We look at legislative races where Republicans were able to retain seats. And I think that is sort of a very important takeaway coming from Tuesday, is that despite the voter registration dynamics, Republicans experienced a bit of a red wave here. And so would love to talk more about that, but commend the party, the candidates for, like I said, being disciplined and keeping their eye on the prize.
Yeah, I mean, history, right? Watching on Tuesday night, what I love about election night is it doesn't end there. The fact that we could even name a president, right, officially project one, I think it was just after midnight, not too long after, was, history in itself. Many folks expected this to go on for days. Obviously, we're still kind of trickling in those last few seats for the House, but just from federal, state, and local, just seeing how these trends have kind of matriculated here. We've seen here in Jefferson County a rightward shift pretty much in most of the counties, even those that are traditionally blue, have been blue for many years and many decades. But again, just the history of it, the first non-consecutive president to return to office in decades. I believe Gerald Ford might have been the last one.
Grover Cleveland.
Grover Cleveland. There you go. The correction.
They look alike.
But looking into the polls of this too, I mean, we talk about how we always like to say the polls are not what we expect them to be. We expect them to be this predictor of who's going to win. And, some folks are saying, well, all the polls said this was going to be a dead heat for president. What happened? But when you look a little deeper in, the polls actually projected, and correctly so, that this voter electorate for Republicans, specifically for President Trump, was going to be more culturally diverse than we saw in 2016 and that we possibly have ever seen. And those polls were dead on. So love to discuss that further as well.
Hey there. Can everyone hear me? Good to see you all. I was in North Carolina for election night, so I'm going to take maybe a national picture on this. It was in 2012 when Barack Obama won re-election, and Democrats were very confident. He had won re-election to the surprise of many, including Republican presidential nominee Mitt Romney, if you watched any documentary. It was a great surprise to folks. He won with 39% of the white vote. And Democrats, right, believed at that point that, and you heard many Democrats say at the time, that this is a permanent majority we have at the Electoral College, that Obama winning with only 39% of the white vote and ushered in a whole new multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. And I have a newsflash for you. That multi-ethnic, multiracial democracy is alive and well. But where Democrats made a mistake was that they thought that a multiracial democracy was going to lead to a progressive society and a liberal government. Speaking to a canvasser who worked for the Harris campaign in Philadelphia, he allowed me to write this down. Of a canvasser, he was knocking on doors, and he knocked on a Democratic voter's door who had voted for Biden in 2020, voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016, and Obama before that. This is an African-American Democrat in Philadelphia. He said, quote, "I see our black Democratic mayor giving tax breaks to build a new arena, but there's no money to fix our sidewalks. Look at our sidewalks, man. They don't even fix them. Look at our neighborhood. Where is the investment? They just take our votes." So as we get into this conversation, I want everyone to recognize that, look, when we look at the numbers more deeply, and we'll be looking at exit polls and the figures, I think, for the next few weeks and months, what President Trump did was he basically galvanized working class men of color into his coalition. Whether or not that will work out for them in the long run will yet to be seen. But I will remind people of this. There were two groups of people post-pandemic, after COVID-19, that saw their life expectancy go down the most. Do you know what those groups were? Hispanic men at 4.6 years and African-American men at 3.5 years. How many Democrats have you ever heard talk about that publicly? We heard a lot about trans rights. We heard a lot about abortion. But how often did you hear mainstream Democrats talk about working men of color, non-college educated men who work with their hands? That was the swing vote in this election across the board. So as we get into this conversation, I want people to be reminded of the dynamics of this. I know everyone wants to sort of reduce it to their particular philosophy. I'll say this to everyone who has a belief on why the election went the way that it did. Whatever you think it was, you're right. This is a big election. Is it? It's a big election with a whole lot of people. Was it race? Was it gender? Having an African-American Indian woman run for the first time ever? Yes, that was a part of it. Was it economic anxiety? The ongoing inflation and the hangover of that? Inflation hangover, it absolutely was that. Was it the cultural resentment that a lot of conservative people had that people were basically marshaling the government against Donald Trump? That was a part of it too. So we're not wrong in our assessments, but this is a big country that we live in, and it's diverse and it's growing increasingly diverse. And I think our ideologies are conflicting with one another is a good thing. But at the end of the day, I think when we look back at this election, we will see that President Trump didn't just transform and change the Republican Party. I see some Republican officials in here who probably can tell you that is so. Certainly our senior senator, Mitch McConnell, is aware of how much the Republican Party has changed thanks to Donald Trump. But Donald Trump has also changed, I think is forcing the Democratic Party to change as well.
Well, hey. So I was planning on being here to celebrate a Democratic victory. So I'm kind of like the fellow Mark Twain talked about, who was being ridden out of town on a rail. He said, but for the honor, I just sooner walked. When we were planning this, we talked about how convenient it was that our regular monthly meeting was the second Wednesday after the election. That is, there was time to decide the election. Turns out we didn't need that. And it turns out, I've been watching Fox lately, that this election was run legitimately. Let that sink in for a minute. That this election was a legitimate election. Well, I've always known that elections are really hard to fix. Try as however many counties there are in America, that's where you'd have to fix the elections. And you just can't do that. So I do hope, seriously, that this puts to the side the notion that we don't run free, fair, and open elections, because that's what this country is about. That's what we live for. That's what we pledge allegiance to. I enjoyed hearing the notion of the Republicans overcoming the Democratic great advantages of money, because Republicans have never had more money than Democrats. But just let's say that they did. Let's say that they did. The interesting thing for those among us who enjoy history is that in Kentucky, up until the 80s, actually our local state and state elections were insulated from the national trends because we had our elections for the legislature and for local officials, mayors, et cetera, on odd number of years. Now, there's a story that the reason that changed was there was a fellow who was Speaker of the House in the late 70s who wanted to run for governor, but it had the same election cycle. And he would have to give up his speakership in order to run for governor. So in case you ever wonder how short-sighted we politicians are, they went around to people to pass this bill to move it to even years, saying you'll get an extra year on the term you're serving. Talk about a stupid reason to do something. But, there we are. I'm looking forward to answering questions, talking about these issues, and enjoying the program. Thank you for having me.
If you look at the electoral map, lots of red in the middle, except for Illinois. And even in Illinois, there were more red dots than usual. And then blue on the edges. How much of this was so-called flyover country saying, hey, listen to us. We're tired of being talked to the way we're being talked to or talked over. How much of that was a factor in this? Whoever wants to tackle it.
Okay, I'll go first. Lawrence, I don't like those maps, right? Because those maps don't show you population. A lot of those spaces that are red are just land. Let's be honest, right? Like you see all of Montana and you go, oh, there's a lot of red out there. Yeah, there's not a lot of people out there either. It's true. Goodness, go out there. I've been to South Dakota, trust me. It's a lot of land. But if we talk about the cultural implications of this, right, and I think a lot of Democrats make the point of, look, the demographic backlash, the country is becoming more diverse, and was this sort of a demographic backlash to it? Look, Donald Trump did well even in blue states, right? Harris did worse in New York, in Illinois. Donald Trump won a precinct in Manhattan. The Manhattan Bureau president has spoken out saying, Democrats, you need to get this together, right? I interviewed a few times in this campaign former Detroit Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick, who had his sentence commuted by Donald Trump. He was sentenced for corruption charges in his time as the Detroit mayor. At one point in 2004, remember that great, Democratic National Convention where a man named Barack Obama made his debut? Well, Kwame Kilpatrick was already a Democratic star at the time. And he launched into a conversation with me, and he said, look, when I talk to young African-American men in these cities, well, this is when Biden was still the nominee, they would tell me, well, they're both racist, right? When the idea that, oh, Donald Trump is this bigot and he's saying all these ugly and evil things. Well, look, Trump went into those communities and talked to those people. He had many of those conversations. I'm not talking about the people who perform on social media who are being either paid by a campaign or paid by a PAC. I'm talking about actual people. One of them, a young man by the name of Ronald Rulin, Ronald. He was in Philadelphia. We did polling just exclusively at USA Today on African Americans. I had asked them to do that back in January. And we did that in Pennsylvania and in Michigan. And we talked to black voters who back in Michigan said 22% of those black men said they were going to vote for Donald Trump. So we had really telegraphed this months in advance. When I talked to Ronald, he said to me, he worked for his brother-in-law's cleaning company. And he said the same thing. He said, look, Democrats, I voted for Biden last time. Look at my neighborhood. Things haven't really gotten better. I don't really hear anyone speaking or talking to me. And Donald Trump, whether via certain overtures with celebrities or his own visits, went in there and talked to those people. Whether or not that, and all these voters, by the way, never said to me, well, I like Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump is Martin Luther King. No, not at all. They acknowledged the bigoted things that he has said in the past about the Central Park Five, the discrimination lawsuits in the 1970s. They acknowledge all these things. But what they're saying is, look at my community. And when you threaten these young men and say to them, oh, well, Donald Trump is racist, and what do you think about that? Well, they will say to you, look at the community I live in. I'm a young African-American who lives in urban America. Nothing scares me. I'm already being chased. You want to know who's racist? My mayor is racist. My police chief is racist. The housing, the banking, et cetera, on and on and on. And I think when we look at these numbers, when we see that the younger that African-American men got, the more they supported Trump. I'm looking here at the exit polls from NBC News. Black men who are 65 plus supported Harris 87 to 10%. For those 18 to 29, 78 supported Harris, 21% supported Trump. Among those 30 to 44, 24% supported Trump. 45 to 64, 23%. Now, what does that marker tell you? The younger African Americans who were born after the Civil Rights Movement, who are further and further from that, what's the last great pro-black thing that the Democratic Party did for them? And that's the conversation I think you heard a lot. I don't think it's necessarily flyover country. I think it's forgotten country, whether it's in urban America, rural America, or suburban America.
And you look big picture at, just some of the numbers we're seeing, and it's like Philip has mentioned, I mean, multiple things can be correct. But you look at first-time voters, I believe we're looking at 56% of them. That's about 8% of the electorate went Trump's way. Women voters more supported President Biden in 2020 than they did Kamala Harris in 2024. When it comes down to it, you have President Trump's message was very clear to a lot of first-time voters. How is he going to fix immigration? How is he going to reduce inflation further? And ultimately, Kamala Harris spent 100+ days having to spend much of that getting people to know who she is rather than putting policy first and foremost. And I think for a lot of folks, that was easier to digest President-elect Trump's message going in than it was Kamala Harris's.
I want to take it from a national perspective to more of a state perspective. You had a lot of Trump voters vote against Amendment 2, even though President Trump supported it. Ira, start with you. What happened with Amendment 2?
Well, it was a complicated issue. I think proponents for it, I think, underestimated this notion to where it's like, oh, give permission for the legislature to figure out the specifics at a later time. I think a lot of voters wanted to know the specificity of like how will the flow of cash occur, wanted to know the plan up front before they gave that authority. I was able to track some internal polling, the proponents of the effort, and there were a strong number of undecideds that maintained from essentially the conclusion of session all the way up to about 2 weeks out. A large portion of Kentuckians were undecided, were very confused on the issue. I do want to note that it was interesting, I think there was north of like 17 million spend collectively for and against it, and the margin of the defeat mirrored Amendment 1. Now, I think there was about 69,000 more votes cast statewide for Amendment 2, so think about it on the ballot. Folks, went all the way top down, skipped over Amendment 1, and then voted for Amendment 2, as if, they really understood what they were participating in. And so the voter turnout comparison to the presidential election and Amendment 2 were actually quite similar. I think there was a percentage point difference in voter turnout. So to me, that just shows, voters were prepared, they were engaged. I think a lot of them made up their minds towards the end, and the proponents just did not do an effective job reassuring voters that we can trust the General Assembly to put this together. I don't believe the conversation is closed. We've heard some legislative leaders talk about, we're not going to give up on empowering parents with choice to ensure that every student, every family has, educational opportunities that meet their needs. And sometimes that needs to be beyond the public K through 12 system. So I anticipate that the effort, those conversations will continue, but that particular pathway regarding funding, Republicans are going to have to rethink. But going back to the spend, because the margins mirrored Amendment 1, which those of us that paid attention, virtually $0 were spent on that effort. There was some earned media. I would question folks that the opposition, sort of the organizations and the money that showed up in opposition, did that materially have an impact since folks decided to vote yes on Amendment 1 and then no on Amendment 2? So I would question ultimately, was there a real fighting chance for Amendment 2 to prevail? And so I question, if I know Andy Beshear, Governor Beshear was a loud voice on Amendment 2. But again, and there was some spend on for it as well. But did we even have a chance? I think that's something that I think a lot of us will break down later. But the issue is not over.
I think a big question is, and we could talk about this, all of us. I mean, was the vote in rural areas of Kentucky, where you have either singular public school districts, maybe two, where private school, charter schools aren't an option, is that too much to overcome, I think, as a conversation to be had?
Well, and the fact that they were lying about what they were planning to do was a problem for them on Amendment 2. They were clearly taking public money and giving it to people who are already paying for private school and calling that reform. So I think they just got caught lying. It's their problem.
Okay. Well, there we go.
I'm not running for nothing.
There you go. You're free. You're free. You're free. Look, from my standpoint, I think that Republicans always make a mistake when they screw around with public educators in this state. If there is one group of progressive organized voters in Kentucky, it's public school teachers. Ask Matt Bevin, right? Oh, he can't, I guess, anymore. He's no longer in public life like that.
Well, he could give you the honest answer.
Yeah.
That's the...
And I think what, and Isaiah said it, in a lot of these places, look, Kentuckians love their teachers, right? A lot of people, when you ask them who their fondest memory of, it doesn't matter if they're liberal or conservative, they mention Miss Merriweather, Miss Hinkle, right? Like, that's the person they think of. And I think Iris is right. There was no specificity to it. I think, again, because teachers and public educators are very well organized, I think it's very hard for Republicans to crack that. And if they do try again, I think that it might do them well to spend some money on those campaigns and also be more precise. Because, again, I don't think that there's a lack of support for school choice. right, and certainly parts of West Louisville and other places. But I do think that there is a resentment for any time you try to hurt or harm or criticize public teachers or public educators in this state, and I would advise folks to stop doing it.
Ron, please.
Collected quite a few questions from the audience related to the future of the Democratic Party. Whether or not this is a pivotal moment for the party, whether or not there needs to be a change in messaging, in leadership, and whether or not this is a point where the Democratic Party needs to be reborn. Curious about each panelist's opinion on that question.
I'll knock that one out. Well, clearly, something has to be done differently. And I think the simplest thing to do is, first off, let's don't forget that gender and race had an impact on this election. Anybody who denies that is just denying human nature. What the impact was, the number that it was, I don't think anybody can ever find unless we can find people who are on some sort of truth serum to answer the polls. Polls just won't find that. But our messaging has to be about to do what the Republicans have done successfully for years, and Democrats too, but I'd say Republicans a little more successfully, finding easy to explain villains and scary things. That's all you need, is villains, somebody to be against, somebody to be afraid of, because they're a scary thing. Whether it's foxes having the caravans of armed South Americans, Central Americans in most cases. Whenever you wondered how they thought things were going for the Democrats, all you had to do was watch and see if they had a caravan. No caravan, Democrats weren't a threat. If we were a threat, they'd show caravans. So we have made a big mistake in not using the issues, for example, healthcare, access to healthcare. It's not about healthcare, it's about access. Democrats have changed that materially in a good way because we have provided Americans with easier access to healthcare. We've got to get a villain so that we can illustrate that in 30 seconds or in 16-second TikTok videos. We have not been good at that. The minimum wage is another great example. Donald Trump isn't for a minimum wage. He's not against raising the minimum wage. He isn't for it. His people aren't for it. Rick Scott told me in person, you know, Rick Scott's running for leader of the Republican Senate. He told me to my face, because I was in Congress when he lived here, that he didn't believe in the minimum wage. If we didn't have a minimum wage, he could hire somebody to sit by every bed in every hospital he owned to watch over the patient. Well, you can't argue with that. He probably could. But, I mean, come on. We've got to have a living wage in this country so a family can afford to grow, to live. And we, as Democrats, have worked for that neighborhood that Philip talks about to provide jobs, to do things, to make insurance available, to provide, you know, it goes back to the fact that it was Democrats who brought us an 8-hour week, a day, 8-hour workday, 40-hour week. They're basic things, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. But we have allowed ourselves to lose the game because we haven't played the game the way we should have.
Speaking of Senate Majority Leader,
Did it happen?
so some breaking news here. Looks like, yeah, Senator John Thune of South Dakota has been.
McConnell wins again. Let me address, I guess, a little bit what the congressman said here. Look, I don't think we should really blame too much of this on the vice president, right, Kamala Harris. She inherits this race literally with 3 months left after the Democratic Party did everything it could to really torpedo this election. And by that I mean that, look, we were hearing, remember, Joe Biden promised in 2020 to be a transitional figure. He promised that I'm going to hand the baton off. And somewhere along the way, he thought that he was the only person who could beat Donald Trump. I remember my colleagues who worked at the White House, Joey Garrison and others who were working there, and we were talking about amongst ourselves that the rumor was that Biden was going to drop out right after the midterms. Didn't do that. And then this White House continued to gaslight not only the press, but the country to tell us that President Biden had no issues whatsoever, even though it was apparent to anyone with a pair of eyeballs that an 81-year-old in his condition was not going to really energize Democrats to vote in this election. And only until he literally shuffled out there in the June debate, and everyone who watched that debate literally gasped and realized this is a lot worse than we were told. And then at that last minute, we hand the baton to the vice president, who now has the unenviable task of both being an incumbent in an anti-incumbent election and trying to convince the American people that, I'm going to be somewhat different, while also refusing to say where she was going to be different than President Biden on. She was asked that question repeatedly. We talk about race and gender. Obviously, racism and sexism in this country are real things, right? My family is a representation of that. I have documents in my home that underscore that, right? My great-grandfather was denied even buying a home in Shawnee Heights because the deed said no one of African ancestry can own this home. However, I will point out two things. One, Lisa Rochester became the first black woman to be elected to U.S. Senate in Delaware. Angela Also Brooks was elected the first black woman to ever be in the U.S. Senate out of Maryland, right? At the same time we talk about these issues and things, we also have to acknowledge that the Harris campaign made some critical mistakes. You spent $13 million on event production for Lady Gaga and Katy Perry. But when the Congressional Black Caucus, this was in Politico, and we reported on this as well, when the Congressional Black Caucus came to the Harris campaign with a $10 million plan to focus on undecided black voters in swing states, the Harris campaign said, no thanks. So at the end of the day, whose fault is that, right? Is that the voters' fault? Is that the Harris campaign's fault? If we want to look to the number one culprit of this election, that person is the leader of the Democratic Party. That person's in the White House, and his name is Joe Biden.
You have to ask yourself the question, too. There was such a period during that last month and a half, where Vice President Harris was repeatedly asked, how will you be different than Joe Biden? Because her name is attached. It is the Biden-Harris administration, or as Republicans would call it, later on, the Harris-Biden administration. She didn't really have a good answer to that question, repeatedly given the opportunity. And then one of the closing remarks that President-elect Trump's team really harped on, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And I had a political science professor tell me, it's not just the price of eggs. That's like the joke, right? The price of eggs, it's the price of groceries, price of cars, and then these images that some of these swing voters specifically, they vote based on reaction to the top priority issue in their area, in their lives, day to day. And if the price of everyday goods and the images seen at the border, regardless of what you believe is your situation, these folks felt that was the bottom line. And ultimately, they felt President-elect Trump could do a better job.
Not really in love with being in a position of trying to encourage the Democratic Party to change its ways. But I mean, if I could have like one tagline, demography does not equal destiny is probably what I would share with my Democratic counterparts, that demographics don't guarantee destiny of an election outcome.
You touched on this. I think Iris did it first, but if you could comment, all of you, on the Metro Council races, what it means for the future of Louisville politics, and combining another question about the fact that I think next year the races go nonpartisan.
Right.
So how does that impact everything?
Yeah, come 2026, the next cycle, so Louisville mayor and Metro Council races will be nonpartisan thanks to actions by the General Assembly. So for the first time, in this post-merger form of government, we'll experience that similar to what Fayette, Lexington City Council experiences, and so more to come on that. But yes, so the Republicans have a wider margin now since the inception of merger. And even though Democrats hold the majority, with the slimmer margin now, where Republicans were able to flip 3 seats this year and retain the 4. And so, having that 14-12 Dem to Republican composition, it enables the Republicans on council to not only react, but really dictate the flow of business of Metro Council. And I think one sort of encouraging thing in this room, there's not really like a Republican or Democrat way to fill a pothole, right? And so a lot of the city council issues, for the most part, that we experience really aren't hyper-partisan. And so the Republicans being able to stick together as a caucus and peel off a couple of votes is absolutely within reach. And so Republicans sort of are energized and have a real ability to have influence of not only the agenda, but to actually push an agenda. So a lot of us are excited to see with sort of these new opportunities what that does to translate into action, to build in more accountability, and to really tap into some deep frustration. So when we look at the 3 areas where Republicans flip seats, there's been some interesting trends, right? So Governor Beshear was able to be successful in these Metro Council districts, particularly in the Southwest Corridor, but Trump has as well, right? And so these voters absolutely split ticket in this year's election cycle and previous cycles too. So they've shown a propensity to be dynamic in that way. But particularly when we zero in on the southwest part of Jefferson County, there are some deep frustrations about the quality of life. And so I'm encouraged that the voters' voice prevailed in these cases, and that I hope Metro Council and this mayor take that tone, take that referendum seriously, and that we see, a renewed focus, particularly on economic opportunities for the Dixie Highway Corridor and some of the southwest parts of town to truly elevate that area because it's sort of untapped when it comes to talent and workforce and business opportunities. I think there's a great opportunity for Metro Council, I think, to reprioritize and see what we can do to essentially help outside the urban core.
This is the slimmest margin since merger, right? This is 14-12. Since I've reported here in Louisville, which is not that long, all things considered, summer of 2021, I've seen just about all of those South End counties flip red. 2022, then 2024. The number one thing I get told when I'm reporting outside the Watterson, how do you feel about the metro area decisions, whether it be Metro Council, whether it be the mayor, decisions they're making? Number one thing I hear, where our property taxes significantly higher are going to the city and we're seeing none of it back. We're getting forgotten about. They're not thinking about us. And that has translated, in my mind, into the votes that we've seen here in recent years. And as far as the nonpartisan election thing, I know that there are different thoughts within the Republican Party on how that's going to affect the long term. I know there are also maybe some evidence you're saying R&D, it's working right now for the local GOP. So I think it'll be interesting to see going forward, how that trickles down. But so far it seems to be working for them.
I'll turn this on its ear a little bit here because I covered City Hall in the beginning of my time. And Isaiah's right. This is the closest the official margin's been 14-12, right? But really, when you look at the actual numbers, won't Republicans really be in control already? I mean, think about it. You're going to have a Democratic Socialist in District 6. You have Councilman Tammy Hawkins, who particularly on public safety issues, kind of skews more conservative anyway. A lot of those council members often rebel. And no offense to Mike here, but in a lot of Democratic circles, Craig Greenberg's already a Republican in the way he behaves on a lot of issues. In fact, a lot of Republicans in the state legislature love Craig Greenberg now. So
you're saying he's already nonpartisan?
No, I'm saying he's already a Republican. When it comes to public safety issues, he's far more like Rudy Giuliani than he is, a liberal Democrat, or even definitely to the right of Greg Fisher, definitely to the right of Jerry Abramson. So we talk about the partisan part of it. What I'm looking forward to seeing is, has that coalition behind Craig Greenberg broken up at all? I'm already hearing rumors about who might run for mayor. I think you're definitely going to have a left-wing challenger, perhaps, a more grassroots person. I think a lot of the Democratic coalition here locally has fractured post-Breonna Taylor, right? I think a lot of that has sort of disrupted how they do their politics. I wouldn't be surprised, from what I hear from sources here in the state of Kentucky, if someone like a Michael Adams runs for mayor of Louisville. I think he was someone who would really disrupt and sort of shake up politically a lot of the things here in Jefferson County and Louisville Metro. So for me, I look at that and I go, Republicans really already have, I mean, this is not a progressive Metro Council compared to other cities. So to me, I look at that and go, of course, that's the trend, and I think Councilman Cohen can speak to this. That's been the trend in the South End for some time now.
Well, a fun thing about, well, you mentioned Grover Cleveland. I mean, I knew Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland was a friend of mine. And Donald Trump, you're no Grover Cleveland. I've had that in my head all this time, apropos of nothing that was just asked. But a couple things. One, because I knew Grover Cleveland and I've known politicians mostly since then, the areas of the county that Iris is talking about actually had Republican legislators when I was in the legislature. The state reps, the state senator, those are Republican areas. They've gone back and forth for years and years and years. And as to the question of Joe Biden and his unwillingness to give up the presidency, again, from what I learned from Grover and others, is there is only one known cure for the political addiction that that people have. Only one known cure, and that's embalming fluid. He was just never going to give that up until he literally had to. And I did have a fun time. Nancy Pelosi was in town, and I served with Nancy, and we're friends. And so I got, well, it's kind of like getting John Wilkes Booth to sign a Lincoln button for you. I got a Biden-Harris button and got her to sign it. And that's what it took. It took literally somebody making him do it. But I think what we've learned from Donald Trump, and you've heard it from what Philip said and about having done essentially mini focus groups. Is that a fair way to say it? Is Lincoln, who, well, remember Trump compares himself to Lincoln a lot, said that you can fool some of the people some of the time. You can fool all the people some of the time. You can fool some of the people all of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. Well, what Donald Trump has done has fooled just enough of the people for just enough of the time.
Thanks. Hey, Ron, we're coming up on 10 minutes left, and obviously we want to hear everyone speak. So this may go ahead. This may be our last question, but go ahead, Ron.
Well,
Thank
then
you.
everybody will have to forgive me because I will make it overly broad to cover as many of these questions as I can.
Thanks, Ron.
The era of sitting around the radio and listening to political speeches is over. Nowadays, information is in our face 24/7, this new information system known as social media. So, one, there's been a lot of concerns about misinformation being available regularly in people's faces. Two, there's been questions from some of our younger folks as to how young voters are supposed to proceed in this era of constant information, some of which they can and some of which they cannot trust. And finally, tied to this issue of this social media era and all this information, there's been several questions asking whether or not we could ever get back to a point where these elections and politics are a little bit more friendly, less contentious, and less in our faces with such a divide in our country.
Okay, that's a lot. So I think in an era where we're not at a deficit of the sheer amount of information, I think some of the takeaways on the information front from this cycle is that if you are an engaged voter, that you are proactively seeking out information so you can be an informed voter, that you have options, right? And so what that should do, and what we saw from Republicans from the Trump campaign, is that sort of that more replicating that face-to-face interaction matters more than ever. I'm still trying to kind of analyze how I feel about some of like sort of that podcast movement, sort of the long forum of getting a campaign's message out. Was it a factor? I mean, we'll study that more to come, but I think replicating that approach is impactful where voters feel direct connection to the candidate, where you can experience that authenticity, where you can hear sort of the longer responses so you're not getting sound bites that are clipped down to TikToks, right? And so I think, what we need to do as an electorate is to empower our family, friends, and neighbors to do their due diligence, right? I think that burden's on us. And going, Ron, to the latter part of your question of how can we replicate the Louisville Forum to the masses, right? Like, where we all come in, we have our shared values, we have our core beliefs, but we're coming here today with an open mind and with respect, so we can learn and we can hear each other and just, potentially push the limits, the bounds of our thought process. And so, I think until voters demand it, we're not going to see a change of behavior from any party, from any of the candidates. And it's funny, I'm actually having conversations like these more, like I was on WHAS 11 having the same discussion of what can we do to tone it down? And good or bad, these elected officials, they're political creatures. The answer to us, the answer to likely voters, the folks that are going to put them in office. So until we demand it, until we make it a forefront issue, until we demand that the rhetoric is toned down and it's more respectful, we're going to continue to get what we're feeding into. And so I know that's a little bit of a Miss America response, but that's something that I think we need to replicate is, we need more Louisville forums, I think, throughout our country that says, like, the water's fine, come on in, that it is okay for us to have different points of view, but let's air it out, let's have that conversation, and absolutely let's do it in a respectful way. So I think until we build it, they will not come.
I turned 28 in April. I know I don't look it. I can tell you, my friends from home, all different education levels, the days of young adults going out to seek this information out because they feel it's their civic duty are largely over, unfortunately. They want to be sought out in the form of podcasts, live interviews. So like you had mentioned, take the edits out. Let's see how these people, these elected officials, folks running for office, answer these questions that they care about. And this concept that, no offense to either campaign, that you can bring these superstars on stage and that'll get people to vote a certain way, these younger generations are smart. They're actually tired of that. They do want to hear about the issues. So I think if there's a time, obviously we're likely going to see the trifecta in DC when it comes to Republican control, but especially for Democrats, the time to get back to the issues, I would argue, is never more important than right now. And a point I want to make, based, again, professors, experts I've spoken to, they've said the biggest mistake the Democratic Party could make is to overcorrect here, to almost fight the war of the past. I think the parties have to look forward, is what they've told me, and understand what the issue is when 2026 comes around, when 2028 comes around. But ultimately, when it comes to young voters, you have to meet them where they are.
Okay. When it comes to misinformation and disinformation, I think Isaiah and I have a responsibility to be a little self-critical. We in the media have not done a great job. And I'll tell you what we have not done a great job on. We have not done a great job in terms of holding everyone accountable with the same level and volume. We often, and I don't think that it's this sort of liberal conspiracy bias in news media. I think our profession is often biased for sensationalism. I think we are often biased for capturing that celebrity culture first. When Isaiah just mentioned, let's talk about the issues. Well, what questions are we actually asking here, right? Like, a lot of these questions that sometimes we ask are really just surface level BS about, what's your favorite pair of underwear? What's your favorite artist? Can we get to like the real stuff here? So I do think that we, as a profession, do need to look at our responsibility and role in this and how we hold people empowered to account. We need to be just as vigorous in asking, if President Biden cannot run for office, how can he still be president? Right? The same way in which we scrutinize, and we have to scrutinize, President Trump and the many draconian authoritarian things he said on the campaign trail. I was there when he said these things, right? There are mixed status families right now in this country who are very, very nervous about what's going to happen January 20th. There are many LGBTQIA folks in this country who are very worried about their future in this country. There are folks who from a regulatory standpoint, should be very worried if you get Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on the hands of our healthcare system, our water supply, and everything else. And we have a role and a responsibility to continue to hold him and his administration accountable. As far as misinformation and disinformation itself, I've seen the numbers for USA Today and other media organizations and friends and colleagues who work at CNN and other places. And I'll give you a piece of good news. More and more people are searching out, not going to social media to get their news, but they're actually trying to find it on their own. And we have a responsibility to put that at the forefront. It's going to be a nasty fight, Isaiah. It's going to be a nasty one. You're going to have to try a whole lot harder to tell people the truth and get them the truth. As far as with our JCPS students and people are asking, I would say this. After the pandemic, and this is a generation that has had their proms taken away, had their, like all the things that you all take for granted, that was wiped away in this pandemic. This is the pandemic generation. So when they say we outside, they mean we outside. So it means maybe the real world isn't that bad after all. Maybe these phones and online isn't the end all be all of our politics. Maybe you should get more involved civically with your organizations and start your own. Physically, like, you know, that thing called the real world, it still exists and it still operates pretty decently. So I would just close in saying that, yeah, I think that we as members of the news media need to be a little more self-critical. I think, as some of you in here have known, I'm a jerk to everybody. That's one easy way to do it, right? Just be mayors, council members, governors, presidents, Republicans, Democrats. They are not your friends. They are the people who work for us, all of us. So, again, that's my parting on the media criticism piece.
Well, hey, Iris, don't we always say in politics, reporters are not your friends? Oh, I do. They are my friends personally, but we have different jobs. But speaking of IRL, we need to
In real life?
Yeah.
There you go, okay.
Sorry.
There you go.
Well, of course, I thought that WTF was Why the Face, so I stole that from a TV show. The thing that we have to always do, and people have done this since the beginning, probably in Roman days and before, is meet people where they are. Whether you have to have a circus to get a crowd to sell your message, or whether you go on a podcast. Democrats not doing the interviews on the Super Bowl is just so stupid because there are people watching. If you don't have a message you're willing to share with everybody who might be watching from anywhere, you don't have a message. And politicians forever have been in really rough situations. I mean, ask Alexander Hamilton how things can come out. It's a rough business, and we have to tell the truth, be straightforward, and give, real life answers. And that's what we forget. We get, and I say we, I mean it. We get so into the spin and the slick way to say something or the slick way to say nothing. We can't win with that. No, neither side can win with that, but it's always been like that. Remember, the newspapers were owned and started by partisans to get their messages across. So what's old is new, and what's new is old. And for the students, don't give up. There's just no reason not to be involved. I was lucky my mom was real involved, and it gave me that kind of passion. And I hope that passion is showing through today, because I have it just as much as I did when I went after every afternoon in my senior year of high school to a mayoral campaign headquarters. And please do it. Please, please, please do it.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for our speaker. And next December, I have the date, December 11th, I believe, where our likely event is going to be on the coming Frankfurt legislative agenda for 2025. Hope to see you all here. Thank you.